Chapter 7 The Beginning. That Abbot Augustine and his monks should be housed by the king's command in Canterbury, that he should give them the church of St. Martin, which had been the queen's own chapel in which to preach and pray, was so comforting to some of the brethren after their ordeals that they became quite puffed up. Here, surely, they decided, was a sign of God's especial favor. Divine grace, they were assured, had moved the king's heart to kindness, and this indeed argued, they said, that their early faults, their timidity, that must be called cowardice, has been forgiven. But on Good Friday, Augustine preached them such a sermon as none who heard it would ever forget. Watch and pray was his text, and its chastening message was very clear. After that, even the most self confident among them was ready to be humble. Every one of them prepared eagerly for the exacting work that now lay ahead. Much of the work was practical. The Church of St. Martin was in poor repair. It had been in disuse for many long years when the Queen came to Kent and took it for her own. Also, the lodging given by the king must be enlarged to hold the community. The king lent them masons and carpenters. He gave them land to till and sent farmers to help and advise on the ways of a soil and a climate so unlike what they had known. The king did not call for any account of the gifts he made, nor come to see how the building progressed, nor listen to the word that was preached by his consent. He had his large realm to administer. He was often away from his capital, and that was reason enough. In his absence, the queen would sanction this or that improvement, commending the work of both monks and laymen, and making herself in all things their benefactress. Wolf and his father were lodged in the gatehouse of the monastery with two of the porters. They looked after themselves as they were accustomed. Wolf still helped Brother Adrian in the kitchen, though not all the time. He was most in demand when it came to bargaining with the local people. He always went to the market with Brother Adrian and Brother Leonardo, the butler. Also, he was now able to work with his father about the administration of the land, to keep tally of grain and meal, and arrange for such things as milling and the care of beasts being fattened for slaughter. But with so much to do himself, with so much going on around him, he was often restless. He was homesick, he told himself. He realized with a renewed sadness that his mother was truly dead, and he missed Anna, from whom he had parted voluntarily. But for all his sorrows about his mother and his sister, what bothered him most of all was parting from Fritha. She had somehow made up to him for what he had left behind in Rome, and now she was left behind in her turn at her father's farm. Day after day he planned to walk to the coast and cross to the island to see her, but day after day he was kept busy and the opportunity did not come. And then one morning at the beginning of May, he went to the market with Brother Adrian and Brother Leonardo, and there was Siniag driving in two fat sheep for sale, and Fritha walking beside him. She must have washed her hair, for it tossed as light as feathers on her shoulders. Wolf dashed toward her and then stopped. He had not seen her for weeks. She might have forgotten him. Wolf! Fritha's face lit up with pleasure and excitement, and she ran in her turn to meet him. I knew we should find you if we came to Canterbury. Sa- Siniag paused when he heard her voice. He looked at Wolf and gave him a quick, friendly nod. How are things with you and the brothers, Wolf? You have been missed. Is your father well? He is very well. Are these fat sheep for slaughter? Brother Adrian will be glad to look at them. He is there with the swineherd. He'll call me to bargain in a moment. Sure enough, Brother Adrian, a very determined expression on his thin, dark face, was looking about him for help. He had chosen a sow and her 10 piglets, and now the swineherd was haggling over the price. As Wolf went to answer Brother Adrian's appeal, he knew that Fritha was following. It gave him pleasure to conduct the business in a very forthright and efficient manner, knowing that she was watching and listening. I shall see you in sole charge of provisioning soon, Brother Adrian said, but you'll have to take your vows first. Is Wolf to be a monk? Fritha cried. No, Wolf laughed, because the brothers were always slyly suggesting he might discover he had a vocation to become one of them in the service of God. He knew there had been dismay in Fritha's tone, and that made him want to laugh too, just for sheer pleasure of her interest in him. Rather red in the face, he changed the subject. Siniag is here with two fine sheep, Brother Adrian. Will you see them? Yes, show me. Here's Brother Leonardo, too. He's a better judge of sheep than I am. Speaking in two languages gave Wolf a feeling of power and pleasure. He stood with the three men, and they all listened to what he said. Siniag says they have been fed on milk, brother. Tell him that is a good as good a joke as any. Brother Leonardo doubts you, Siniag. Doubts me, does he? Tell him it was from the second milking. Siniag says, brother, and so it went on until the bargain was made to the satisfaction of them all. This was a good day for Wolf, fine and sunny, with jobs well done at its very beginning, and a meeting with Fritha to make it complete. 2 fat sheep meant not only meat, but also wool and mutton fat for the salves made by Brother Paul the infirmarian, and candles, too, which would be the everyday candles. The altar candles were made of finest wax. The brothers and Siniag fell into conversation with Wolf as a go-between. About them the bustle of the market continued. Then they said goodbye, and Wolf and the 2 monks began to drive the sheep and the pigs back to the monastery. The piglets constantly became separated from their mother, whose fierceness was alarming. So Fritha came to chase the little ones back each time they strayed. Then Siniag came running to give a hand himself, and between them all at last they got the animals to their quarters. Wolfston was at the gatehouse, and he and Siniag greeted one another as old friends. I've been looking for you, Wolf. Take these tallies to Brother Severus at the church. He will need them at the end of the day. The tallies were for the workmen, who could exchange them for goods in payment of their labors. Such matters were often handled by Wolfston here in Canterbury, because he spoke the local tongue. Brother Severus was in charge of the rebuilding at the Church of St. Martin, not because he was a builder, but because he was a disciplinarian. The church was being mended with love, however, and so he was seldom able to find fault. Therefore, he bullied the masons and others whom the king had sent, so that they grumbled and threatened to go home. Wolf had glanced at Fritha as he took the bag of tallies and started off down the street. He was fairly sure that she would come with him. He heard her say something to her father, then her bare feet padded along the dusty road after him, and soon she had caught up. They left the road and crossed the fields between the priory buildings and the church. They found great activity at St. Martin's. The west wall was being repaired, and a new supply of brick had just been brought in. Men were bringing the bricks a few at a time on their shoulders. There was a long string of them crossing a nearby meadow and disappearing over a slight mound. Some of the men were laborers from the city, and some were monks with their gowns kilted up above their knees. Wolf handed the tallies over to Brother Severus. That's a great lot of brick, brother. Where's it all coming from? It's the when of it, not the where of it, that I care about. We were short of bricks. Bricks were found. That is good enough for me. I expect it's a hole in the ground, Fritha said. Often and often bricks come from a hole in the ground. You can't dig bricks out of the earth. Uthra found some in a hole and made a new wall. That was very clever of him, but you can't, said Wolf obstinately. Dig bricks out of the earth? You mean stone. No, I don't mean stone. Come along then, I'll show you. Over here, that's where the bricks are coming from. But when they reached the place, Fritha seemed to be right. There was a gaping hole several feet wide and long. Then they saw what had happened. The workmen had opened up a great heap of earth and stones, and underneath lay the ruins of a house. Out of the ruins, they were taking any bricks that were good enough. As Wolf looked at the place, he felt a strange pang. So much of what he looked down on was familiar. It was a house that had been built long ago by the Romans, and Romans had lived there, and here he saw a score of simple things that made him think of what had been his home. Part of the tiled floor was showing through the dust and rubble, and the patterns on the tiles were patterns he had seen 100 times in Rome. He went into the ruins and began turning the dust over with his toe, tracing the line of leaf and flower and grape. And here, close by what must have been the kitchen quarters, he found an old hold pot, like one he had watched Esta stirring over the fire at home. He picked it up and held it, and it was as though he held hundreds of years there in his hand. Here the Romans had come and stayed and built, and they had brought order in the new land, and they had turned gradually from the old gods to the new faith. And then they had gone away again. At home, their empire had crumbled, and there were no longer men enough to leave in this far island, while the mother country was threatened. Wolf knew only a little of this, which had been taught to him when he was in school, but all the lessons he had ever had could not tell him more than this ruined house with its broken ornament and the battered cooking pot covered with earth, which he held in his 2 hands. For as though it were a mirror for his imagination, he seemed to see some old solid Roman coming home quickly from a city council, calling to his wife to gather all they had possessed and be ready to leave. And they had dropped the cooking pot and broken it, and it had lain there ever since. It must have been at that time, Wolf thought, as though a great bank built against the tide had been broken and torn away. Through the gap left by the withdrawing Romans, the barbarian hordes had poured in, bringing dark and bitter days, slaughter and oppression, and the return of black paganism. Now Wolfe found himself with Frithia at his side, wandering through Canterbury with eyes newly opened. Over and over again he saw familiar things. A block of masonry supporting a drinking trough bore a Roman inscription. Two delicate pillars carried the front of a barn. A flight of steps leading to a rough stone house had been made from lengths of chipped cornice of a design he had seen often in Rome. And when they came by the city pound, there half a dozen goats and geese waited to be claimed. He saw that this enclosed place had once been a bath. Water still trickled greenly through two ducts, and among the tall weeds lay many broken columns, with bits of their decorated capitals. But the heavy bases had vanished, hauled away, no doubt, as the bricks of the villa were being hauled away to repair the church of St. Martin. You are so silent, Wolf. I have news for you, but you won't listen. What is it? He asked quite roughly, for he had been far away in his thoughts, seemed hardly to be his own. It was not only to sell sheep that my father came here today. To sell the sheep and take back grain instead? No, no. To buy cloth? Cloth indeed. Do you think my father is rich? He has only the smallest part of the farm. Hardra has the rest. If we want cloth, we must weave it ourselves. Then tell me. No, he gave her all his attention, and wondered that anything so dry and ordinary as dust and stones had distracted him. He might not see her again for months, and he was letting the day go by. Wolf, my father has come to ask if we may be made Christians. It was the beginning, that day, when Syneog came to Canterbury and asked if he might speak with Abbot Augustine, was the beginning of great things. It was a signal to the people who, though never hostile, had yet been reluctant to listen. So many changes had torn the land that they were wary. But Syneog, who was one of them, offered himself for baptism, and his daughter with him. From that moment there was keen curiosity. When Augustine preached in the church in the marketplace by the riverside, they began coming to hear him. A few, then many, then a whole flock. They could not understand what he said, and they frowned over Brother Sylvanus's not very eloquent translation. But it was Augustine's manner and his eye and his harsh commanding voice that bound them. They seemed to understand those better than any words. There was little doubt that some of them thought Augustine was himself a god, but gradually they were dissuaded of this, accepting what at first seemed a disappointment. A Swedish old father wanted to sacrifice a kid to Father Augustine, Fritha told Wolf, half scandalized and half laughing at such simplicity. Wolf frowned, but not so much because he was shocked by the tale. He did not relish any talk of a Swede, for she was Uthra's mother, and Uthra had still to be reckoned with. Did they understand, Wolf wondered, that when Fritha became a Christian, she would no longer be Uthra's promised wife? Unless, of course, Uthra became a Christian too. There was a great turmoil for Wolf over this. How could he wish Uthra to remain pagan? Yet how could he honestly welcome him as a Christian? It was the end of April when Syneog and Fritha came to the church of St. Martin to be baptized by Augustine. He had chosen the church rather than the riverside because a great many of the people who had begun to listen were still chary of listening under a roof, and this occasion might draw them in. And so it did. Many who had stood hesitant about the door finally slipped nervously inside. Others moved in with confidence, for they were neighbors who had listened to Syneog telling them how he had been moved to take this step. They trusted Syneog, knowing him as an upright, honest man whose counsel was worth considering. Soon the church was at least half full. In the choir, the monks followed the lead of their master, Brother Angelo. Their voices soared in the splendid chants that Pope Gregory had made the rule. The occasion inspired them. Their voices had a strong beauty never heard before under that roof. Wolf was kneeling near one of the pillars. It was a good place, you could see everything. He was praying hard, too, for Fritha and Syneog, the first converts, and for all the rest of them, not least himself, and for Anna, left so far away in Rome. It was evening, and there was a yellow sunlight still at the door of the church, and at the arched windows high above their heads. Anna would be sitting down with Ursula and Toulouse and the rest to the evening meal. It was already many months since Wolf had seen his sister, and he knew she must have grown a good deal. He pulled himself back guiltily. This was no way to say his prayers on such a great occasion. He looked across to where Fritha and Syneog were kneeling before Augustine, and as he did so he saw beyond them a woman whose face he knew, a Swede, Hardra's wife, had come to church with the rest. Now there was silence, except for Augustine's voice. By now, Wolf had supposed he knew every note and inflection of that voice. But this evening it was different. So warm with tender welcome, so rich and vibrant with promise that Wolf looked at the face of the man who was speaking and saw it with new eyes. He had found the abbot severe, almost frightening in the singleness of his purpose and his detachment from the rest. But now Wolf saw a face radiant with a happiness deep and selfless and boundlessly joyful. He heard himself sigh. It was a sigh of comfort and content, and brought with it beginning and end. It brought a beginning of understanding and an end of childish things, which had remained with him, though he had long ceased to think of himself as a child. He heard a little splash and a tinkle of water. Augustine had dipped a scallop shell into the great stone jar of water that he had been brought to the church and blessed for this purpose. He held the shell and blessed it yet again. Silence held the crowd together in the church, and their choir was silent too. Now the water was being poured over the bowed heads of Fritha and Siniag. The silence still held, the suspense seemed endless. The prayer Augustine was offering over these, his first converts, was a prayer wordless in its intensity. No one moved. The crowd, the monks, the kneeling figures, the abbot himself seemed frozen into a timeless pattern which might never be undone. Then Augustine raised his hand and spoke at last in a voice that was huge and joyous. In nomine Patris. Brother Angelo flung up both arms, and the monks burst into an immense jubilate. Augustine embraced Siniag and Fritha, and around them everyone stirred and smiled, still awed, but knowing that this was the moment when joy might replace solemnity. Then they began moving closer, until there was a great circle around Augustine, listening far less to Brother Sylvanus, who had hastened to his post as interpreter, than to the abbot's voice urging them and advising them and imploring them, longing to embrace them all, longing to see them safely folded and assured of their own place in heaven, as Gregory had promised them in his heart all those years ago, when he found Wulfstan and Eobald in the Roman marketplace. It was the Swede who broke the circle, making a way for herself to move forward and kneel at Augustine's side. She took his sleeve in both hands, kissing it gently and humbly. Then a neighbor moved up behind her, then another, and another. There was a woman with 4 children, a man with 2 sons. There was a grandfather with his grandchildren, a brother with 2 sisters, old and young alike. They moved steadily closer, pressing in upon Augustine, until it seemed as if he might be lost to a view beyond the crowd. But even Augustine had not been a tall man. Wolf thought that at this moment he would still have towered like a giant above all the rest. Wolf looked round for his father. There was a man standing in the open doorway, but it was not Wulfstan. As Wolf turned his head and the man moved quickly away and disappeared into the dust beyond the door, Wolf was almost sure the man was Hardra. For some time after the crowd had gone away, Wolf waited to see Fritha. He waited in the church because he was certain she would look for him there. It was now nearly dark, and the blackness inside the empty church was pierced only by the small eyes of the altar lights. Wolf grew anxious in case Fritha had gone home after all. Then he saw her at the door, faintly outlined there in the evening, looking helplessly into the darkness of the church. Fritha, is it you, Wolf? He went quickly toward her and took her hand. He spoke at once, before he could have second thoughts. Promise me here, before God and his blessed mother, that you will never be Uthra's wife. Fritha gave him her own hand, and they moved together toward the altar, stumbling in the dark on the rough stone floor. Kneel down, then, he said. Her voice was very low. She was not like any Fritha he had known till now, but like the Fritha he had thought of sometimes, an older Fritha, with a firm mind of her own. I promise. Make it a real vow. A promise is stronger, she said. If we pray over it, that will bind it better than any vow. They knelt side by side in the silence, and Wolf knew she must be praying better than he was, because he could not find many words. Then they rose and went outside. Siniag was looking for his daughter, for it was time to go home. There was a rising moon to see them on their way. Father and daughter looked strong and confident. It was a long journey home, but it held no terrors, and their feet might have been winged. It was much later that Wulfstan came home, hungry for supper, which Wolf had got ready for both of them, and full of news. We're going on a journey, Wolf. Father? I've been with the abbot, and he has given us a mission. We are going to find our old home. We are to speak to the people there and discover what gods they worship. If it seems wise, if the time is ripe, 1 or 2 of their brothers will follow and preach. It is a great trust. I'm glad of it. I have waited to do some service for the mission. For Pope Gregory, I owe him everything I have. For a second Wolf did not reply. Then he asked, When shall we go? Be ready to leave at sunrise. Okay, hi guys. So, we have our first converts here. They've gone to the city in the last chapter and they have started rebuilding the church because it was run down and hadn't been used in many years. So they haven't really seen the king anymore, and he has been traveling, but his wife, again, is kind of been helping them, making sure they get everything they need. They're getting supplies, they're rebuilding church, they're rebuilding the place for the monks to live. They're going to the market. And then Fritha and her dad come and say they want to be Christians and they want to be baptized. So they are the first converts, meaning they have converted from their old beliefs and worshiping those false gods to being Christians. So they have a baptism and they do it at the church, and a lot of people from the town come and watch. And it does keep mentioning Fritha's aunt and how she keeps coming up to Augustine and how she was watching very closely. And then it says at some point that her husband was watching in the doorway and then disappears. So there's a little bit of what's going to happen with that. And now Fritha and her dad are the first Christians in Kent. And then Wulfstan comes to Wolf and tells him, we're going to go to our old house and see which gods they're worshiping around there and what's happening in our old town, and then maybe send for some of the monks to preach the gospel. And he says, be ready to leave first thing in the morning. So Wolf was so excited because Fritha was probably going to be around more coming to the church, and he had finally seen her after a while because remember, he left where they were together near the ocean and came to town, and now he's going to leave. So, and he's very much missing his sister, and he's starting to kind of miss Rome.